This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. Here's a question, or rather 3.
How do scripts like this ever get approved?
What criteria are you using for selecting these non-funny comedy slots?
Who has passed this drivel for broadcast?
They're not talking about feedback. They mean programmes that are intentionally funny, and their writers. We'll be finding out how new ones get chosen, from a woman who only wants to make you laugh, and often succeeds, but occasionally seems to make you cry with frustration. And what about the fortunes of that joker Jazzer from the Archers? Last week on Feedback, he was reviled as a malign Scottish stereotype. This week, his defenders pore over Hadrian's Wall and carry him head high to the Bull, where they buy him several rounds. While in another part of the bar, some of our other listeners are toasting an afternoon play about travellers. And would you swap this?
It is 9 minutes to 7. There is a scallops war going on between the Isle of Man and Scotland. Scallops are big business for the Isle of Man, for their fishermen. They've banned larger ships from fishing.
For this.
Right, Celebrity Raspberry, that's
Celebrity Raspberry.
We started with this yesterday. It's a brand new Celebrity Raspberry. All we know is that it's a man, an actor. Right? Here it is.
Listener Heather Dontonville and her teenage stepdaughter Jenny are swapping their favourite radio stations for a week. How will they survive? But back to Radio 4 comedy. Series like The Now Show, and I'm Sorry I'll Read That Again, are almost universally adored. Others, like Listen Against or The Odd Half Hour, divide the audience. The occasional one bombs, which, according to our inbox, seems to have been the case with What Went Wrong with the Olympics. But in the never-ending search for new talents, risks have to be taken. Edinburgh University student and part-time stand-up comic Richard Hanrahan thinks the BBC should take some more. He has a suggestion which he believes could help keep the laughter levels turned up to 11 and nurture new talent, like him, I dare say. This is Richard in action.
The word palindrome is a word describing a word which can be read the same both forwards and backwards. However, the word palindrome is not a palindrome. I propose to change the word palindrome to palinilap. The words gonorrhea and diarrhea are too similar. I propose to change it to front rear and rear rear. That is the end of my list of words I'd like to change. Thank you very much.
A short clip of a performance by listener Richard Hanrahan. Will you be hearing more of him? I don't know, but someone who might is Jane Berthoud, the BBC's head of radio comedy, who joins me, along with Richard. Well, Richard, do you think you're ready for Radio 4 then, after that performance?
Maybe not. Who knows?
Does it appear to you the BBC has got a monopoly in this area, and if you can't get onto the BBC in some way, you can't get on at all?
No, there really isn't anywhere else to go, and it seems that the BBC is stuck in a certain model of production, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Radio 4 comedy is beyond doubt the best radio comedy in the world. It's just a case of only a certain few manage to get to that level.
Now, Jenny, is there any chance that you might turn up in the audience at Edinburgh, somewhere like that? I mean, how do you find new talent?
By doing exactly that, Roger. In fact, Miles Jupp is a case in point. Miles Jupp, like Richard, was at Edinburgh University. I was in Edinburgh visiting, went along to the Stand. I'm sure Richard knows it. It's a comedy club in Edinburgh. Saw Miles. He was at the university, as I've said, and he's now about to have his own series on Radio 4 that he's writing, and he's a star in Rev and all the rest of the things that he's now doing.
But how about if you hadn't had the good fortune to go to Edinburgh University or one of the top universities or any university, supposing you're trying to make a go of it in Carlisle, for example?
Well,
I mean, you're not going to stop off there, are you?
I haven't been to stand-up in Carlisle, but quite a lot of people have been to stand-up in Carlisle. I mean, there are comedy clubs, as we know, all over the country, and we have producers who visit places.
But so many people, so few programmes, a bit like going through the eye of a needle. And I think you, Richard, thinks that the BBC could do more than just broadcast comedy, don't you?
Absolutely. I had an idea that the BBC should start doing more to develop new talent by offering online environments for sketches, either through a curated podcast or like a social network for sharing, distributing and nurturing talents.
Are you talking about a sort of a BBC U comedy tube where people could put their own performance onto that equivalent, and so it's much more easy for people to find them and to judge them.
Absolutely. The current systems there are is basically to use YouTube for radio sketches, but unfortunately these sort of harbour the wrong sort of skills for radio comedy, because it's very different from, say, the video sketches that get made, and it's a lot more time that's needed to work on the actual sound and developing scripts and things.
Well, we do have a writers' forum where some of that will happen. There are certain rules and regulations that apply that would limit what we are allowed to do, in that the BBC Trust have said that they don't want us to make any podcasts that aren't already being broadcast, because they don't want us creating services by the back door, is how they see it. Some kind of internal forum, an extension of the writers' forum or something, could possibly work. There is also already, though, BBC YouTube, where these things happen, and we have an online where you can send in videos of performing. And
But you accept Richard's distinction that a lot of people, perhaps most people, want to do visual comedy, but radio comedy, with that sort of appeal to the imagination, is something that, well, shouldn't be seen, and therefore there needs to be a non-visual
Well,
YouTube
curiously,
in that
this
sense.
is where we're not allowed to do the podcasting, so it is an odd anomaly that if Richard wants to take up with the Trust on our behalf, I'm very happy for him to do so. In the meantime, though, of course, we have got places for new talent to go. So Newsjack on Radio 7 is a great example, recording for training purposes on Radio 4. These are both shows that take almost entirely non-commissioned new writing, and those writers then move from those shows onto some of our other shows.
Richard, are you trying to use radio to get to television?
Absolutely not. For one thing, I'm not really suited to the look of TV. But my love comes through radio comedy. I've grown up with, I'm sorry, I haven't a clue, I've grown up with Red Dwarf on radio, and Goodness Gracious Me. Loads of shows that really have inspired me. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, of course, which started out as that is actually far superior on radio than the TV and the film versions. All these things are really important to me, and there's a massive community of comedians who have this shared love of radio comedy.
Well, Richard, can you tell us a joke for the end? We heard at the beginning a nice piece by you about palindromes and so on. Have you got a joke to end our recorded with? There you are, putting you on the spot. Unfair, but you'll have to put up with this.
Look after the pennies, and the pounds look after themselves. Though do look after the pounds, as they're worth 100 times more than the pennies.
Richard Hanrahan and Jane Vertu, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
BBC Radio 5 Live announced plans this week for a new topical news comedy show to start next spring. I'm hoping you'll let us know what you think of it. But in the meantime, let me know your views on anything you've heard on this or any other BBC radio station. Contact details are on the feedback pages of the Radio 4 website. Now, Jazza McCreary seems to have much in common with Marmite, or Simon Cowell. You either love him or loathe him. Last week we spoke to the actor Ryan Kelly, who plays Jazza in The Archers. Some of you thought his radio persona was nothing more than that of a stereotypical boozy Scottish layabout and womanizer. Before the interview, I asked my wife if she could think of a single redeeming feature of the car thief turned pig handler with a penchant for deep-fried snacks. She couldn't. But no surprise there, says Newlack, who posted this message on the bottom of my Radio 4 blog.
I would not expect the wife of Roger Bolton to be acquainted with deep-fried chocolate bars. Every meal would be carefully assessed. Comments, queries, criticisms and congratulations freely made. Poor standards would not be tolerated.
But we do have HP sauce on the table. Well, when my wife isn't looking. Back to Jazza. Why is it that some women are attracted to unsuitable men like Mr. McCreary? That's partly a cry from the heart, but it's also because, after last week's interview, many of you, virtually all women, sent in your emails in praise of Jazza.
I have to praise you like I should.
I'm Christine Harfleet. Jazza is wonderful. Every time he comes on, he just makes me smile. He's such a lovable rogue.
You can make porridge as good as MD. Mama taught me that.
This is Deborah Fox. I love the fact that he's completely determined not to be tainted by the namby-pamby middle-class values of the rest of the village, and I think he adds a lot. I like him very much.
The only time to eat porridge is before a sesh. Lines the gut beautifully.
He lets everything flow over his head, and look how clever he was when there was a punch-up in the pub, and he just stepped in. He did it brilliantly.
Anne Metcalf. I have never thought of Jazz as a stereotypical Scot. To me, he's just a stereotypical bloke.
Can he be bothered?
You know, as he's talking, you could imagine him sort of scratching and sort of yawning and sort of, you know, making unmentionable noises.
That's a top suggestion.
It adds to the richness of the character and really makes me laugh.
He's just so good-natured. I won't have a word said against him. I wouldn't like to live with him, mind you.
Oh dear, he'll be unbearable. There's only 1 week left before we take our 2-month Christmas recess, much to my bank manager's disappointment. But you can leave a message for me at any time on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could be more expensive on some mobile networks. Or if you want to write, the address is Feedback, P.O. Box number 67234, London SE1 P4AX. And now, some more advertising from the BBC.
Right, what are you getting your mum for Christmas?
A kettle.
Oh, not another one. She's got enough to open a shop.
Kettles are us.
Not this year, they're not. Get her a digital radio instead.
A radio?
No, a digital radio. All the stations are listed.
That Christmas advertising campaign is run by an organisation called Digital Radio UK, which is part funded by the corporation. It's the perfect Christmas gift. But here's a paradox. You'll be able to hear such adverts on the BBC, but not on some commercial stations who are refusing to run them until digital is easier to listen to. The politics of digital broadcasting are surprisingly difficult and complex. But what of the programmes? According to 11-year-old Finn Morgan from North Yorkshire, not bad. He emailed feedback@bbc.co.uk to tell us how much he loves BBC Radio 7's Crime and Thrillers Hour. Finn is among the 15% of the population which is listening via digital receivers, although nearly 25% listen to digital via other platforms, like the internet. The government says that the planned switch from FM radio to digital by 2015 is an aspirational target, which will only happen if 50% of the country is listening digitally at that time, and the quality is as good as the current FM signal. So will that 2015 aspiration be met? Former systems engineer David Coburn doesn't think so.
I think it's unrealistic, and it is forcing huge costs on the people at a time of austerity. In our house we have between 7 and 10 FM radios. To replace each one of those would cost at least £50. We have one digital radio. Quite often the reception we have drops out entirely. It's bad in wet weather, and the benefits to us just are not there. It may be great for the BBC to want to push out some new radio stations, but also you have to look at the context of the BBC withdrawing some radio stations because they weren't popular enough.
But what does the BBC think, which of course is putting money into the Christmas digital advertising campaign? Tim Davey is the BBC's Director of Audio and Music. I asked him if the campaign to get decent DAB coverage in 90% of the country by 2015 is still realistic.
I think 2015, and I've said it before, is highly ambitious. The BBC would not want to see any switchover unless you had clear evidence of mass listening to digital and good penetration of digital devices. I think the idea that we force a lot of listeners to a situation where they have to get rid of FM devices and not have something to listen to on digital is clearly not in the interest of the head of BBC Radio.
When would you say, without doubt, we will have digital switchover?
I'm not going to give you a date. I'm not going to give you a date.
Not 10 years? Not 15 years? Not 20
I
years?
think there will be a switchover. I think it's been extremely helpful to put a stake in the ground and say, could we get to 2015? I say that's ambitious. I quite like ambitious targets. We'll see how we go.
There's concern about coverage. What about quality? Because there are still a lot of our listeners who are not persuaded that the quality is superior, is that digital actually sometimes is worse than FM.
In terms of the areas that are covered by a digital signal, I would be the first to say that we're not there yet. So, I know some of the listeners out there will say, I just can't get a good signal. Let's be clear, before the radio industry would say to people, we're moving away from FM, we must have full coverage of a DAB signal.
And yet, despite this, you're running a campaign, or rather supporting a campaign, which says digital radio, more to love, pushing it hard. You're pushing something which you have reservations about.
When you say reservations, I don't think it's quite the right word. I'm saying we're building out coverage. I would not endorse a switchover unless coverage were as good as FM. At this point, I think it's utterly appropriate for me as the BBC head of radio to say those people in areas of coverage, and it is important, by the way, when people buy radios, they check that they're in an area of coverage. We absolutely say that repeatedly. But if they're in an area of coverage, I would absolutely say buy a digital radio, because you can get Radio 7, the joys of 6 Music, etc.
But in terms of this campaign, let me quote something said by William Rogers, the UKRD chief executive, part of the Commercial Radio Network. He says it was fundamentally immoral and dishonest to run the campaign, knowing that DAB infrastructure is not good enough, and knowing full well that when people buy a DAB radio, it may not work when they get it home. The BBC should be ashamed of themselves for running this ad. They are telling their listeners to buy something which they know isn't ready for us yet.
Well, I mean, it is one voice, and I would say one voice among many in commercial radio.
Yeah, and there are quite a few others who, again, refuse to run the ad.
Absolutely. And I think their beef, by the way, is slightly different to that articulated by William, but it's really straightforward. 88% of the people in the country can get a signal. If you can't get a good signal, I wouldn't recommend digital radio. If you get that coverage, we would absolutely recommend, I think it's utterly appropriate, to say to people, go and get a digital radio to enjoy the full range of services.
But the commercial radio sector, or some of it anyway, saying this is precisely the thing the BBC should be doing. It should be investing and spending so that everybody can get digital coverage.
We've said in the last few weeks, and part of the BBC agreement with the government was to build out national coverage of DAB services. The debate with local radio, just to be clear, and this is a bit complex, so apologies, but is around the local layer of DAB. And we are negotiating out those costs at the moment. While that negotiation goes on, in pretty tough financial circumstances for the BBC, it's understandable that people say, well, we need a bit more clarity. I agree with them.
Can I ask you, though, whether the BBC's enthusiasm for the potential of digital in terms of stations is waning? For example, you did propose the closure of 6 Music and the end of the Asian network, at least as a national station. Are you still in love with digital?
It's a fair point. The idea around looking at the lineup of stations was never about taking money off the table for digital. We want to keep investing in digital, and I think in terms of our commitment to digital, this is not just about DAB, this is about internet services. We've just said on Radio 3 we're launching HD Sound, which will be a wider signal through internet radio. I think as the head of BBC Radio, I really want to see radio develop into a more competitive marketplace so that it can grow. The idea that the BBC just sits on FM spectrum and there's no growth in radio, to me, seems a pretty limited vision of the future for the industry.
So there's no doubt about the destination, only the amount of time, the speed at getting there.
Radio's going digital.
Tim Davie, the whippet-thin head of BBC Radio, who is obsessed with marathons and who this year ran the 48 miles from home to work for charity, with radio headphones on, I hope. Now, here's a coincidence. On last week's feedback, the novelist Joanna Trollope told us she wanted to hear more experimental drama on Radio 4. Days later, her pleas were answered. Many of you got in touch to say how much you'd enjoyed Atching Tan, the afternoon play about travellers, and written and performed by them.
A word.
Laura's a married woman now, Dad, and ain't got nothing to do with it.
Well, you ain't married, lovey, and the Lord strike me dead if I don't give you the idea of your life tonight.
Just for learning a few lines. Where's the arm in it?
I really like the smattering of Romany words throughout. I think I just about knew that shufti and kushti were Romany words, but there were lots more, and the way they were used, it was quite sort of effortless, it seemed, but it was in such a way that you could follow them.
No mistake.
Doug, black as night.
You'll be the talk of this sight.
Are you ashamed of your own people?
Of course I ain't ashamed.
Then why ain't we good enough for you?
I loved the play. It felt a bit like a documentary at times, as it sounded so real. I thought the actress playing Lovey was simply outstanding.
Thought I might find you by the fire.
I've been so bloody stupid.
He was just a
It
teacher.
went a long way to representing a part of our society that really doesn't get much of a look in general in the media. And it just kind of came across as very authentic because I think of the fact that the actors, a lot of them are from the community.
You think they're going to accept you? Treat you like one of their own? When you get off the site and sit down to dinner with them, you think you'll be one of them?
I don't want to be one of them.
You can't live in a house. You'll never be happy in brick. You can't live without freedom. None of us can.
I never said I wanted to live in an house.
You leave this world, and our people will never have you back. Won't even want you. You'll be dirt. Filth. You'll be
Hi, I'm Beryl Matthews. I particularly enjoyed the many-layered approach to this archetypal story. I enjoyed the authenticity of the Romany actors, the feel of the locations, the insight into what was for me the unexpected aspects of the Romany culture, and the complexity and sad realism of the ending. And I'd love to hear more.
You're Lavinia Hemfold, a gypsy.
And thanks also to Angela Kingston, She-Wolf and Stephen McMahon. The producer of Atching Tan was Charlotte Riches, and I asked her how the project came about.
Well, it started life about 3 years ago as a pilot for BBC Three Counties Radio, who also runs the Romany Theatre Company. And
a pilot for a play, a drama series?
Yeah, a pilot for a short drama about the traveller culture. And it was really, really successful. Got a lot of really good feedback, and on the back of that, it was commissioned as a 36-part series for BBC East, which would run over 3 years. And on the back of that series, the Commissioner Jeremy Howe for Radio 4 saw the potential there and commissioned a Radio 4 play.
So if you live in East Anglia, you could have listened to 36 episodes of this.
Yes, and it's also, the entire series is online.
You see, I'd have thought it was a very difficult thing to do because of the perhaps understandable suspicion that the travelling community had of the media, certainly news, current affairs and so on. Did you find any great difficulty working with them?
This came from within the community. This wasn't the BBC going to the traveller community and saying, let's make a splash and do a drama about travellers. It was the traveller community coming to us and saying, actually, what we really want to do is represent the traveller community as it really is, as authentically as possible.
But where did you get the actors from? Because if they're all travellers, presumably lots of them won't have acted before, or certainly not professionally.
No, not at all. The great thing is with Dan running the Romany Theatre Company, he's been working with travellers, often doing dramatic projects for over 7 years now, so he's built up a huge bank of contacts, and basically he just helped us recruit the actors. So it was a fantastic opportunity for them to get some experience, in a media that often they kind of are quite wary of.
Now, how do you react though to the fact that some of our listeners, while they loved the play, were a bit worried that you weren't challenging stereotypes?
I think we do challenge stereotypes. Obviously, I think, travellers are often represented as kind of scroungers or thieves or caricatured really in drama. And what we really wanted to do was kind of represent an authentic version. And obviously, in a short space of time, we could only focus on a certain, amount of characters. I think that's the beauty with having the local radio series as well, because there is much broader representation where there's other kind of stereotypes that we do challenge there. It's fantastic that it started this debate about the representation of travellers.
And finally, Charlotte, for those who didn't hear the play, what does Atching Tan mean?
It's Romany for stopping place or where the fires are lit. So kind of when travellers were travelling around and they'd kind of settle down for the night, that site would be their Atching Tan.
Charlotte Riches, and there's a link to the Atching Tan website on our website. Now, imagine a whole week without John Humphreys, or Jonathan Dimbleby, or even better, me. Could you bear such a devastating gap in your listening life? Heather Dontonville's about to find out if she can. Here she is in her kitchen with Radio 4 as usual on in the background. But Heather is leaving the cosy world of the four heads behind. She's taken the feedback challenge to give up her favourite station for a week, and instead will be waking up with Chris Moyles and going to bed with Nick Grimshaw. She's trading places with her stepdaughter Jenny, who's an avid Radio 1 fan. I spoke to them at their home on the Welsh border, on the eve of what could be a life and relationship-threatening experience. Heather, when was the last time you listened regularly to Radio 1?
About 10 years ago, when I first went self-employed, and I remember listening to Mark and Lard in the afternoons.
So do you feel culturally deprived not having listened to it for that length of time?
Strangely, no.
No, you're not looking forward to wall-to-wall Chris Moyles?
No, not particularly.
And how about you, Jenny? Have you ever listened in a sustained fashion to Radio 4?
No, I've never really listened to Radio 4, but it's always been in the background because Heather listens to it a lot.
Why haven't you listened to it? Do you think it's not for you in some way?
I don't think it's my kind of my choice of radio. I think I would prefer the music rather than listening to news.
Well, we'll find out whether it's what you fear or you get a pleasant surprise. But you will miss the music, won't you?
Oh, yeah. I thrive on music.
And I mean, how much of Radio 1 do you listen to during the day? What time do you wake up in the morning?
I wake up at about 7:30.
And does Radio 1 go on automatically?
Most of the time, yeah.
Yeah, and
it's my alarm.
And late at night too?
Yeah, I drift off to sleep listening to it.
So this is going to be a real test this next week without Radio 1 music. Yes.
Very difficult.
How about you, Heather? I mean, do you think that the peaceful life of the Dontonville household is going to be under stress as a result of this swap?
I'm a little bit concerned, actually, especially first thing in the morning. I'm very used to having today as my backdrop as I sort of, shovel Weetabix into a toddler, and I'm not sure Chris Moyles is going to do anything to smooth that process.
You're a bit of a news nut, aren't you?
Very much. News and politics, current affairs, yeah.
Well, there is some news on Radio 1, you know.
Well, I'm prepared to give it a chance, yeah.
Now, as well as news, Heather, what else will you really miss not listening to Radio 4 for a week?
I think it's the wonderful little random nuggets that come my way when I'm listening to things like Start the Week and Midweek, In Our Time, just, wonderful little subject matter and people. I love the way that these things are just there for me to enjoy, and I think I'm going to miss that sort of exposure.
And how about you, Jenny? What will you really miss? Which programme on Radio 1 is just the one you really don't ever like to not hear?
I think I would miss the chart show with Reggie Yates on Sundays.
Oh, you'll go in on Monday morning, you won't know what number one. This will be terrible.
I'll have to ask Heather what's number one.
Oh, the humiliation. I can't bear it. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to this. Actually, by the way, just before we finish, why have you agreed to this? This is a high-risk strategy. Why do you want to do it, Heather?
I think it's fun. I like these sorts of opportunities, and I don't want to get too dyed-in-the-wool, too stuck in my ways.
And can I ask you, Jenny, what happens if you get hooked to Radio 4? Would you dare admit it to your friends at school?
If I got hooked to Radio 4, would I admit it? Probably not. It would be my secret. I wouldn't let anyone know that I'm a Radio 4 junkie.
We'll be hearing from Jenny and Heather this time next week. That is, if they're still speaking to me and each other. You can check their progress in the meantime via their audio diary and on our Twitter feed. You'll find a link to both on our feedback webpage. But I wouldn't encourage the rest of you to go switching your allegiance. You never know what you might find. And anyway, we'd miss you. It would be unbearably lonely sitting here in this cold, silent studio waiting desperately for the slightest tweet. Goodbye. The BBC's head of radio comedy, who joins me, along with Richard. Well, Richard, do you think you're ready for Radio 4 then after that performance?
Maybe not. Who knows?
Does it appear to you the BBC has got a monopoly in this area, and if you can't get onto the BBC in some way, you can't get on at all?
No, there really isn't anywhere else to go, and it seems that the BBC is stuck in a certain model of production, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Radio 4 comedy is beyond doubt the best radio comedy in the world. It's just a case of only a certain few manage to get to that level.
Now, Jenny, is there any chance that you might turn up in the audience at Edinburgh, somewhere like that? I mean, how do you find new talent?
By doing exactly that, Roger. In fact, Miles Jupp is a case in point. Miles Jupp, like Richard, was at Edinburgh University. I was in Edinburgh visiting, went along to the Stand. I'm sure Richard knows it. It's a comedy club in Edinburgh. Saw Miles. He was at the university, as I've said, and he's now about
to play about travellers. And would you swap this?
It is 9 minutes to 7. There is a scallops war going on between the Isle of Man and Scotland. Scallops are big business for the Isle of Man, for their fishermen. They've banned larger ships from fishing.
For this.
Right, Celebrity Raspberry, then.
Celebrity Raspberry.
We started with this yesterday. It's a brand new Celebrity Raspberry. All we know is that it's a man, an actor. Right? Here it is.
Listener Heather Dontonville and her teenage stepdaughter Jenny are swapping their favourite radio stations for a week. How will they survive? But back to Radio 4 comedy. Series like The Now Show, and I'm sorry I'll read that again, are almost universally adored. Others, like Listen Against or The Odd Half Hour, divide the audience. The occasional one bombs, which, according to our inbox, seems to have been the case with What Went Wrong with the...
To have his own series on Radio 4 that he's writing, and he's a star in Rev and all the rest of the things that he's now doing.
But how about if you hadn't had the good fortune to go to Edinburgh University or one of the top universities or any university, supposing you're trying to make a go of it in Carlisle, for example?
Well,
I mean, you're not going to stop off there, are you?
I haven't been to stand-up in Carlisle, but quite a lot of people have been to stand-up in Carlisle. I mean, there are comedy clubs, as we know, all over the country, and we have producers who visit places.
But so many people, so few programmes, a bit like going through the eye of a needle. And I think you, Richard, thinks that the BBC could do more than just broadcast comedy, don't you?
Absolutely. I had an idea that the BBC should start doing more to develop new talent by offering... online environments for sketches, either through a curated podcast or like a social network for sharing, distributing and nurturing talents.
Are you talking about a sort of a BBC U comedy tube where people could put their own performance onto that Olympics? But in the never-ending search for new talents, risks have to be taken. Edinburgh University student and part-time stand-up comic Richard Hanrahan thinks the BBC should take some more. He has a suggestion which he believes could help keep the laughter levels turned up to 11 and nurture new talent. Like him, I dare say. This is Richard in action.
The word palindrome is a word describing a word which can be read the same both forwards and backwards. However, the word palindrome is not a palindrome. I propose to change the word palindrome to palinilap. The words gonorrhea and diarrhea are too similar. I propose to change it to front rear and rear rear. That is the end of my list of words I'd like to change. Thank you very much.
A short clip of a performance by listener Richard Hanrahan. Will you be hearing more of him? I don't know, but someone who might is Jane Bird too. This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. Here's a question, or rather 3.
How do scripts like this ever get approved?
What criteria are you using for selecting these non-funny comedy slots? Who has passed this drivel for broadcast?
They're not talking about feedback. They mean programmes that are intentionally funny, and their writers. We'll be finding out how new ones get chosen, from a woman who only wants to make you laugh, and often succeeds, but occasionally seems to make you cry with frustration. And what about the fortunes of that joker Jazzer from the Archers? Last week on Feedback, he was reviled as a malign Scottish stereotype. This week, his defenders pore over Hadrian's Wall and carry him head high to the Bull, where they buy him several rounds. While in another part of the bar, some of our other listeners are toasting an afternoon